We have it on the authority of Ludwig M. Lockman that the future is unknowable but not unimaginable. So today it's my task to help you imagine the future, if not actually know it. I want to start with an account of an earlier instance where I was called upon to forecast the future. Some time ago I was at a hard money conference, which is rare for me, but I found myself on a panel that consisted exclusively, except for me, of people who write investment newsletters. I was the only academic economist. The others all wrote investment newsletters, as did most of the participants in the audience, I believe. In the question and answer session, a gentleman stood up and simply asked, would each of the panelists predict the price of gold a year from today? And I expect the moderator to simply pass on to the next question, but instead he turned to the panel for our predictions. And I was in the fortunate position of being number 3 on the panel, so I had the benefit of listening to 2 predictions before it got to me. And so I came in with a middling prediction that I thought wouldn't raise any gasps in the audience. After the session was over, a colleague of mine asked, he said, now be candid. He says, weren't you a little embarrassed about being asked for next year's price of gold? And I said, well, yes, but I'd have been a lot more embarrassed had he asked for today's price. So I didn't know whether I'd predicted a rise or a decline at that point. Now, I think I'm not quite as ill prepared to discuss the future of Austrian economics, because I think I do know something about today's price, or I know something about the state of Austrian economics today. And by the end of the hour, I think I will have said something about a prescription for doing Austrian economics, maybe a few proscriptions, some predictions, and certainly something about tactics and strategy for advancing the Austrian framework. But I'd like to preface that with a little bit of the past. We know the future, after all, only in the context of the past, and I'll tell you a little bit about Austrian economics over the last 20 years, and the nature of my remarks are autobiographical to that end. But I'm going to pick up on something that John Denson mentioned in a seminar at the Institute, that in looking at the people who were interested in Austrian economics 20 years ago, it probably is not too much of an exaggeration to say that it all began with Ayn Rand. It all begins with Ayn Rand. That, in fact, was the title of a book by Jerome Tucili that was trying to account for the libertarian movement of the period. And certainly it began that way for me. And we can recognize that even Murray Rothbard was for a time involved in the inner circle with Ayn Rand. In fact, Jerome Tucili tells that story. He didn't last for long because it was discovered at one point that Murray was married to a Christian. And Ayn Rand insisted that he began looking for a more suitable mate. When he didn't begin looking, he was excommunicated, but felt no big loss. In fact, he'd grown tired of Ayn Rand's genuine Russian accent and Nathaniel Branden's ungenuine Russian accent. And he said he'd gotten tired of being referred to as Rosbot, which is the best they could do at pronouncing his name. Well, I began reading Ayn Rand when I was in the military. I was in the military and had a degree in electrical engineering and was working on electronic countermeasures. It's kind of like fuzz busting, except you're going for the airplanes, trying to keep them from detecting U.S. planes coming into North Vietnam. And I suspect knowing what I did then and thinking back about acquaintances that also were reading Ayn Rand, that Rand was read by people from the hard sciences. I don't think you would find people in the 1960s who were majoring in economics in American universities being attracted to Ayn Rand. If those people were attracted to the research agendas of American universities in economics, they certainly would not have been attracted to Ayn Rand. So one of the observations I'll make is that a lot of the early Austrians, of my generation at least, came in from the hard sciences. I read Rand's Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, and gravitated towards economics, the economic content of it. After all, I had something of an engineering mindset, and economics appealed to me. It had a certain logic to it, a certain structure to it that I had always sensed was missing in my undergraduate days. I avoided social science courses. Avoided that too. Avoided social science courses while I was an undergraduate precisely because there seemed to be no logic and no structure. I followed my nose through the reading list of Rand's book. She provided a brief, about 38 books or so, reading list in the back of Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, and I think I started just reading them in alphabetical order. Start with Benjamin Anderson, Economics and the Public Welfare, and start working through until I could pick up the thread and get a little better direction in reading economics. That list contained Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, which for many people, I've heard Walter Block say so, was the book that inspired them into economics. 8 books on the list by Ludwig von Mises, and none actually by Murray Rothbard, although my memory tells me that they're on that list. He had already written America's Great Depression and Man, Economy, and State, but they weren't included. Now, reading Mises, I soon ran on to citations to the work of Murray Rothbard and began to pursue it because my interest had turned to the issue of the Great Depression, business cycles, that seemed to be one of the most intriguing aspects of the Austrian school. And I remember I had to get America's Great Depression through an interlibrary loan. The U.S. Air Force didn't carry America's Great Depression in their own base library. So I was a self-educated Austrian, although I had a very biased viewpoint of it at the time. I thought that was just economics. It was just economics. I didn't think it was some special brand or that it was apart from something else that was called the mainstream. I thought I was just educating myself in economics. And when I got out of the military in 1971, I decided to go back and study economics. Actually, I, as so many others, had our sights on an MBA. Get an MBA added to your engineering degree, and you're very marketable. That was my initial thought. But gee, economics is more interesting, and surely engineering plus a master's in economics would be as marketable. Well, that's wrong. Okay, if anyone's heard that, don't believe it. But nonetheless, I found economics interesting, so it was the economics programs that I applied to, and I applied back at my home state, Missouri, because that's where I'd gotten my engineering degree. I thought they might take me back, even though I had no undergraduate training in economics. And I remember very well when I submitted my application to University of Missouri at Kansas City, I appended to it a reading list. I thought that if there's any doubt, that this engineering graduate might not know economics, let me just append a reading list. I'll show them what I've read. That should get me in. Okay? And I remember including on that list things like Ludwig von Mises' The Anti-Capitalist Mentality, and Murray Rothbard's Power and Market, and even a book by Shirley Shibla called Poverty is Where the Money Is. It was that was an expose on Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program. Still a book I recommend. Great reading. Well, I learned soon enough that at the University of Missouri at Kansas City there were no Austrian faculty members. In fact, it was sort of divided up into three or four camps. There were institutionalists of the Veblen Ayres variety, there were Marxists, and there were Keynesians. A few neoclassicals, but not big enough to constitute a camp. Okay, and I was accepted into the program, not because of my reading list, I'm sure, but in spite of it, and soon began to study economics in the mainstream, so-called. Now, looking back, the only way I can explain how I survived that program is that every faculty member thought I must be in somebody else's camp, okay, and so I steered clear of them all. Now, still, the issues that interested me were macro issues and business cycle issues, and the closest we got to it was Keynesian macro, the familiar ISLM diagrams that you've all come to know, if not love. And I even detected that there's a certain vested interest here, not just among faculty, but among students too, that if you spend lots of time and hard labor learning what those curves are and how they fit together and how to shift them around, how to milk out the conclusions from changes in the initial conditions, you get something of a vested interest. You want it to be true, or ultimately you really don't care whether it's true or not. If you can do it, you want to defend that set of graphics. And I hit upon the idea while I was at Kansas City that it may take a set of graphics to beat a set of graphics. The Austrians at that point had no graphics, or what they did have was scattered around. I hadn't been categorically opposed to them. I could find triangles in prices and production. I could even find supply and demand curves in man, economy, and state. They were always a little kinky, they're never quite smooth, but lots of graphics. But they weren't put together. And I thought, well, if these could all be put together to tell some coherent story about macroeconomics, some coherent story about boom and bust, then maybe that would serve as a counterweight, a counterbalance, or alternative to ISLM analysis. And sure enough, I was able to piece together graphs that I took from Rothbard and Hayek, from Bombeverk, from Wicksell. None from Mises. I never found a graph in Human Action or Mises, but patched the rest of them together and made a graphical exposition of macroeconomic relationships according to the Austrians. Now, I actually turned this in as part of my coursework in macroeconomics at Kansas City, and fortunately, the professor was a Marxist. And I say fortunately because he believed in labor theory of value. And he could tell that I'd put in great labor on this paper and gave me high marks for it. Turned it back to me, but confessed quite candidly that he had not actually worked his way through this graphical analysis. He was something of a shaker and mover, though, within the department, and he had, to my surprise, the suggestion that I present this paper at a professional meeting to be held in Chicago in April of 73, I think it was. It was a Midwest Economic Association meeting that April. And I quickly agreed to present the paper. But then I began to think, I may be in trouble here, because literally no one has read this paper and given me critical comments on it. The professor admitted to not having read the paper. None of the other faculty members knew anything about Austrian economics, nor were any of the students interested in it. So a little bit mortified about this. Here I'm going to present this at a professional meeting. And so I did the one thing that I could think of, and that is I shipped off the paper to Murray Rothbard. After all, I had drawn from his work. And maybe he would either give me some encouragement about going to Chicago, or at least give me time to renege on my agreement to go if it turns out the graphics were all wrong. I had never met Murray and read his books, though. About a week after I sent the letter, I got a phone call. It was from Joey Rothbard, and very pleasant voice, very personable, indicated that her husband would like to speak to me about the paper I had sent. And Murray came on the phone. I was expecting a very solemn economist, deep voice or whatever. Instead, I heard this cackling, high-pitched voice with plenty of irrelevant or irreverent asides about the state of the economics profession. Clearly, he was enthused about the set of diagrams, which might be kind of hard to understand until you realize that Murray thought it was a great exercise in sort of beating the Keynesians at their own game. Right? It's not that he was going to launch into some graphical analysis of his own, but he was happy to see somebody doing battle with Keynes essentially on his own turf. And in mid-conversation, he asked me, he said, well, will you be coming to New York anytime soon? And I had no plans whatever to go to New York at all, but I managed to say, yes, I'll be there for spring break, at which time he invited me to dinner and further discussion of the graphics. Well, I went to New York spring break in March, just a month before the professional meeting in April, and was treated to a very nice dinner at the Rothbards, just the three of us, Murray, Joey, and myself. But after dinner, more guests arrived. It turns out Murray had photocopied the paper and given it out to others who were interested in it. They all came with their papers marked up, ready to discuss. This is what I thought graduate school would be like, you see. But this is my first taste of it in Murray Rothbard's apartment. Well, the evening passed very quickly. We went through the paper. Comments were mostly positive, but lots of critical, helpful remarks on how to clarify and modify in one form or another. And time passed, and I began to worry about overstaying my welcome. It was about midnight, and I finally began packing up my papers and making gestures towards the front door, and was surprised that Murray seemed puzzled about my leaving and even insulted. Well, it turns out I had no idea that he was a complete night owl. Okay, the day had just started for him, and so I sat back down and we went on discussing not only the paper but the Austrian movement, the libertarian movement, quite a little bit of gossipy things about others in the movement. And I finally managed to get away from the apartment about 4 a.m. par for the course for Murray. He had invited me the next day to attend a class that he was teaching at Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute, which I did. Now, it turns out that even though I went to Chicago with more confidence than I otherwise would have had, the presentation at Chicago was a near non-event, which sort of disappointed me until I found out later this is why they call them professional meetings. I mean, the people bounce their words off the back wall and head for the bar. No one pays much attention to papers at professional meetings. It certainly was true of that one. But that disappointment was overshadowed by the fact that Murray had invited me to attend a conference at Cornell that summer of '73. It was a history conference. He and Forrest McDonald were giving lectures. I went and learned a lot of history there. I was a little bit out of my element, but met a lot of like-minded people, and more importantly, got put on invitation list for future conferences, which included just the next year, 1974, the South Royalton Conference, a conference held at South Royalton, Vermont, that is now regarded as the beginning of the revival of the modern Austrian school. Let me tell you a few things about that conference. Lectures at that conference were given by Murray Rothbard, also Israel Kirzner, and Ludwig Lachmann. In fact, the purpose of the conference, or one major purpose, was to persuade Lachmann to come out of semi-retirement and teach at NYU. And in order for him to be willing to do that, he had to be convinced that there were students out there actually interested in Austrian economics. Well, it turns out our meeting was at this abandoned law school in South Royalton, Vermont, eating out of a kitchen that had been jump-started for the purpose, a very modest setting, very difficult living for the weak. And that, if maybe above other things, convinced Lockman that this group really is interested, if they're willing to put up with these quarters for that duration. We also had surprise guests on the first night. Milton Friedman showed up to our opening banquet. Not because he was a big fan of the Austrian schools at that time, or this for that matter, but he lived nearby, and he had a summer home in Vermont, and he played tennis with Ken Templeton, who was one of the organizers of the conference, so he came down for a tennis game and dinner. And it was at that dinner that he announced that there's no such thing as Austrian economics, only good economics and bad economics. We didn't press him at the time if there was such a thing as Chicago economics. I assume he took that to be the good. Anyhow, that statement by Friedman had a certain galvanizing effect. One certainly unintended by Friedman, but it had a galvanizing effect on the conference. There was, too, something called Austrian economics. And through the week we began to discover what it was. Kerzner, who lectured at that conference, summarized the Austrian research paradigm years later in an entry to the New Palgrave Dictionary on Economics, and he identified 5 different aspects of the Austrian school. The Austrians are unique for their attention to the writings of Karl Menger, which gives us the origins of the idea of the spontaneous order as developed by Hayek and others in the school. Secondly, the Austrians are unique in their attention to the capital structure, the intertemporal capital structure, and hence the intertemporal allocation of resources as guided by the interest rate. That's the essence of Austrian macro. More about that later on in this lecture. The Austrians are known for theories that imply laissez-faire, sometimes more thoroughly than does the neoclassical counterpart. They favor market solutions to economic problems. And they're noted for paying attention to market processes as opposed to equilibrium states. Although I have to say that the term market process has come to be something of a code word for a certain brand of Austrian economics at George Mason University. And lastly, the Austrians are noted for acknowledging the uncertainty that characterizes the future and the need for market mechanisms to deal with that uncertainty. Sometimes you hear the adjective radical appended to uncertainty, radical uncertainty. And again, more about that later in the lecture. Well, I think that does pretty much sum up the characteristics of the Austrian program. And I can say rather blandly, until you consider the alternatives, I can say rather blandly that the future of Austrian economics simply lies in the development of this distinct research program. Okay, so the prescription that comes out of this is simply work on and within this Austrian framework. And a little later on I'll have some suggestions of just how to do this. But first I want to show you that that's not the advice that you get from other quarters. And I want to look at a couple of alternatives to show you that and show you how important it is to come back to the Austrian framework and work within it. The alternatives are best laid out in a recent book by Karen Vaughan. It's entitled Austrian Economics in America, The Migration of a Tradition. And in that book, Vaughan lays out the future of Austrian economics in terms of a crossroads. We're standing at a crossroads, she says. And the roads are clearly marked Kerzner and Lockman. These are the two alternatives. And I'm going to show you how she characterizes those alternatives and then suggests that there's a third alternative that she and many others in the Austrian movement these days tend to overlook. She identifies one alternative, namely Kirzner, as someone who provides a supplement to the neoclassical view, Austrian economics as supplementing the neoclassical view. By the way, I think this does violence to Kirzner's writing. I think he's better than that. I think that his work on entrepreneurship shows that that entrepreneurial action doesn't simply supplement the neoclassical view, but rather is central to our whole understanding of the market process. I think that's the essence of his work. But nonetheless, she characterizes it as supplementing. Oh yes, the neoclassicals have it right. They've got the supply and demand. They've got their equilibrium. But they need to say a little bit more about how you get to that equilibrium. And that's when you need to bring in the entrepreneur to help us out, to supplement, to patch it up. All right? But at least that gives you one broad understanding of how some people view Austrian economics. And I could identify others, apart from Kirzner, in which that actually does fit. And here I would think of someone like Axel Landhofen, who is pretty straightforward neoclassical, and yet he recognizes certain Austrian insights. He recognizes that during an inflation, all prices don't rise at once. Some prices rise before others, sort of as a new discovery. We neoclassicals have discovered on our own and anew that not all prices rise at once. He even has a special name for it. Some prices go up before others, such that there's real distortions in the interim. He calls that ragged inflation. It's a special kind of inflation, ragged inflation. Hayek and Mises and Rothbard had a different name for it. They just called it inflation. Okay, it's inflation. You don't need the adjective. Or to give you another example of Austrian ideas as supplement to neoclassical ideas, have in mind the real business cycle theory that's become popular recently. And sometimes what's added to what is otherwise a standard neoclassical interpretation is what's called a time-to-build feature. Okay, time to build. There are a number of models that are called time-to-build models. And there are recognitions or grudging recognition that production takes time. Time has to elapse before the application of inputs and the realization of outputs. Sometimes more than one period. Okay, some processes may take as much as 2 periods. Okay, we could even think of more. And if it takes 2 periods, there may be a middle period there where, middle between the 2 periods, where you have to wonder, should you forge ahead on the basis of your old plan, or should you revise? These are the kinds of ideas that come into the theory with time to build. Well, of course, you recognize this as a Hayekian insight, a Mengerian insight. It's in Mises, it's in Rothbard, and so on. Production takes time, structure of production, and all the rest. But when it's added in a sort of a trivial way of time to build in what otherwise is a neoclassical model, just doesn't work very well. And it turns out to look pretty trivial, and it's been branded as that, at least in the mainstream. So what I would suggest is that the Austrians best leave that strategy for others. Don't simply try to choose piecemeal from the Austrian theory, entrepreneurship or time to build or ragged inflation, and append it in some significant way to what otherwise is a neoclassical theory. That's not a winner. Okay? Not a winner. Don't try that. Although I could say at this point that that does work as a piece of strategy, a hook, if you will. In other words, if you see in the journals articles that involve time to build or some of these other concepts, then that gives you a hook for your own article, where you can show how these features work out well in a different framework, namely the Austrian framework, right? That allows you to connect your own work with what's going on in the mainstream and make it more acceptable by so doing to the mainstream. So use that as a tactic, but not a basic strategy or research program. Kirzner was seen as the supplementer, and the alternative to supplementing, according to Vaughan, was undercutting. And this is Ludwig Lachmann. Okay? Lockman is an undercutter. In other words, he's sort of pulling the rug out from under the whole neoclassical paradigm by emphasizing that the uncertainty that characterizes our future is radical uncertainty. Radical uncertainty. We make no statements about it. We can imagine what it might look like, but beyond that, not much. The key to tuning into the Lockmanian radical uncertainty involves being sensitive to a certain type of question that Lockman asks over and over in his writings. Karen Vaughan does the same thing in her book, which sort of establishes her sympathy for this view. And Lockman will ask things like, how can we be sure that there are tendencies toward equilibrium? Given radical uncertainty, the future is unknowable, and so on. Or how can we be sure that the forces of equilibrium will win out over the forces of disequilibrium, given those same radical conditions? How can we be sure that we learn from experience? All right, you recognize these as different ways of asking what's fundamentally the same question. I've attended a number of seminars with Lockman at summer conferences and at New York University when I was visiting there. And most of his lectures would devolve into these questions very shortly after the lecture began. And students would try to answer. Well, we can be sure because of one thing or another, whatever it was. It doesn't take long before you realize that the only acceptable response is, yes, how can we ever be sure? Yeah, that's what he wants to hear. Now, the consequences of asking in that way, it turns out, is a pretty much wholesale abandonment of economics and plunging headlong into philosophy, and particularly airy philosophy at that, in the form of hermeneutics. What we've seen develop at George Mason and other institutions is really escape from economics. I like to say that the hermeneuticians and the mathematical economists have something in common. Neither wants to do economics. Okay, the hermeneutics abandons it in favor of philosophy, and the mathematical economists abandon it in favor of math. And well, we all have our preference. If they'd rather do math or rather do philosophy, let them do it, but don't call it Austrian economics, or certainly not even economics. Karen Vaughan, in her book, is somewhat sympathetic to the hermeneuticians, and she defends them, quoting from Lavoie and others, to explain what hermeneutic gets you, what it's good for. And she says that hermeneutics provides a philosophical justification for studying the spontaneous order. Well, I'm not sure that it does, especially after listening to Barry Smith the other night. But I suspect that those of us who are interested in economics and want to press on with the Austrian research program can assume that there's a justification for it. And if we have doubts, I suppose we can ask David Gordon if he can come up with some justification for our studying economics. And I suspect he can, and if he can't, well, we can study it anyhow. Okay? I don't think there's any necessity of being a hermeneutician or drawing from the hermeneutics. Evidently, by the way, hermeneutics doesn't provide a justification for doing neoclassical general equilibrium analysis, because hermeneuticians are constantly on the attack, attacking the entire edifice of neoclassical theory, presumably on the grounds there's no justification for it. I recommend that as a bad strategy. Don't spend your time simply attacking the mainstream. Rather, develop the Austrian alternative. And there's a variant of attacking the mainstream, which is even worse, I think, and that is allying yourselves as Austrian scholars with other schools that are in the minority who also don't like neoclassical economics. And this is a strategy that actually gets recommended by some people. I think Mario Rizzo, for instance, suggests that the Austrians should team up as best they can with the post-Keynesians because they have something in common. They both hate mainstream economics. That's in general what's in common. But we can look at it even more specifically and see what's in common. If you read much of post-Keynesian economics, and I don't really recommend that either, by the way, but I've just reviewed a book of post-Keynesian essays, and I have some idea of what these people do. They rely very heavily on this business of radical uncertainty, going almost beyond Lockman, if that's possible. The future is unknowable, it's uncertain, can't say anything about it. Radical uncertainty, even to the point of denying that there are any underlying economic realities that attach themselves to the future. In fact, this is capsulized in an expression by Michael Kalecki, one of the early post-Keynesians. Sort of a aphorism. He says, workers spend what they earn, but capitalists earn what they spend. Think about that. The idea is that capitalists essentially create the future by their decision to spend. And I think you can see the Keynesian element in that, a very strong self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think times are good, spend, they'll be good. Underlying economic realities aside, which is simply beside the point. So that's not the bunch that the Keynesians should ally themselves with, or I'm sorry, that the Austrians should ally themselves with. Now, it's a bit disconcerting to read Vaughan's book, although I do recommend you read it. There's a lot of things in there worthwhile. But she stops at these two alternatives. You have your choice. You can either be a fixer-upper, supplementer, add a few Austrian insights to neoclassical theory, or you can be a terror downer, an undercutter, she would call it, just frontal attack on neoclassical theory, which you want to do. Well, surely there's a third alternative, and that's to be a builder, a developer, but a developer within the Austrian framework. That's, of course, what I recommend. We can even take advice in this connection from William Jefferson Clinton, who's known for saying, it's the economy, stupid, okay? Study the economy and not some of the peripheral philosophy that we can well do without. I also take my cue here from Leland Yeager, who recommends for all students of economics, whether you're Austrian-oriented or not, make sure you're dealing with substantive issues. What causes business cycles? What policies are recommended? Work out solutions to real problems. Resolve apparent paradoxes or solve puzzles or whatever about the economy. That should almost go without saying until you see what some of the other economists are actually doing, which is simply philosophizing about the justification for studying the spontaneous order. Now, I'd like to get more specific about how to build this Austrian framework, and yet I have to issue a caveat at this point, because I've done my homework, I think. I've looked at other Austrian economists who've tried to give this kind of advice, and there's something a little bit amusing about it. There's a recent book out edited by Bruce Caldwell and Stephen Bohm. It's called Austrian Economics, Tensions and New Directions. And it has articles by a bunch of non-Austrians. It's sort of a strange book, because the people who wrote articles for the book aren't Austrians. And maybe to make amends for that, Caldwell asked two Austrian economists, namely Mario Rizzo and Larry White, to write two final chapters that were afterwards. This is a book with two afterwards by Austrian economists. And Rizzo entitled his afterword Austrian Economics for the 21st Century. Okay, well, so he's setting out the future for you. And Larry White, in standard form for Larry, he writes appraising Austrian economics contentions and misdirections. He'll take off on the title there, and he took issue with some of the people in the volume. But the point I want to make is that the future of Austrian economics to Mario Rizzo looks pretty much like his own research program today. And the future of Austrian economics to Larry White looks pretty much like his research program today, right? So maybe that's inevitable. And so now I'm going to tell you how I see the future of economics. And then you'll know what my current research program is. I'll try to rise above that just a little. One idea I introduced in the literature some years ago was the idea that Austrian economists often take what I call a middle ground position, a middle of the road position. And I did this for rhetorical effect, but the more I wrote about it, the more I began to believe it, and in at least an important sense. And in fact, since then, several have picked up on it, Israel Kirchner being most sympathetic to the idea. But even here, Murray Rothbard picked up on it. He thought that was cute. It was cute to be sort of posture as the middle ground position, when in fact everybody knew he was a radical. Okay. But there is a sense in which it's true, and in fact, what I'll try to persuade you that is that if you are middle ground in some aspects of your theory, that will lead you to the most radical position in terms of your policy. Right, and positions that the Austrians are very comfortable with. Let me give you a few examples and show how it works. Propositions about equilibrium. We can find in the literature economists who don't think equilibrium is ever possible. Its non-existence is almost undefinable. And here you'd put Keynes in this position, and you'd put Lockman in the position. There's no possibility of equilibrium. At the other extreme, you find economists arguing that the economy is always in equilibrium. It's sort of a methodological ruse. You can always conceive of any situation as an equilibrium situation. People like Lucas, but even Stigler and other economists, always in equilibrium. Well, surely the Austrians are in a middle ground position there. They argue that there are equilibrating tendencies. There's the tendencies toward equilibrium. Equilibrium certainly has meaning, as Mises suggested, in terms of the evenly rotating economy, and there's movement towards it. We know from praxeology that we get out of human action. This is the middle ground position, and yet it leads to radical policy. You have to let the market work. You have to leave it alone. You have to let those tendencies have their effect. Okay? If you believe that there aren't any such tendencies, then you need policy in order to fix things. If you believe that the market always works independent of policies, then well, it can't hurt to pursue policies for one reason or another. There's nothing to disturb. The market will accommodate. It will equilibrate. Okay? The Austrians are simply saying that the market works, but it can be derailed by inept policy. So don't do it. Hands off, laissez-faire. This is particularly evident in capital theory, and I mentioned this in one of the earlier courses that I taught. You get three distinct positions about capital. One, again, from Keynes. Read his chapter 12 about capital. And you get the idea that capital in the economy is so unpredictable, so ill-behaved, that, there's nothing much to say about it. And it just drops out of the theory. So ill-behaved, there's nothing much to say. If you read Friedman, you find no capital theory, because he thinks the markets work so well, capital markets are so well-behaved that nothing need be said. It just works. Move on to some other topic. The Austrians are in the middle. Capital markets work. They work if you let them work, but they're particularly prone to being disturbed precisely because the uncertainty in the future. And so it's all the more important that policy not disrupt them. Okay? Markets work, even capital markets, but they have to be let alone so they can do their thing. Something similar in monetary theory, and here I take my terminology from Friedrich Hayek and add to it. Hayek talks about money being something of a loose joint Well, that's a middle ground position if I ever heard one. Money is a loose joint in the market mechanism. There's scope for trouble here, especially if monetary policy is perverse. And it suggests what the two alternatives are. Money is a broken joint. That's Keynes. It's not connected. Okay? It lives a life of its own in the form of supply and demand for liquidity. The other extreme, money is a tight joint. That's the modern new classical school, where as long as monetary policy is predicted, and it will be, it can have no effect. So once again, the Austrian position is the middle ground position. It's a loose joint, and I think that's very descriptive of the Austrian view. I'll even go so far as to say that the Austrians should take a middle ground position on the issue of mathematics and economics. There's a more moderate view that actually is more to the point, and I'll illustrate it. Let me give you the statement of it, and then persuade you that it's true, or try to. There certainly are economists out there who take mathematics as always being relevant. If a problem is not mathematically tractable, then it just can't be considered an economic problem. Samuelson is in writing to the effect that if it can't be if it can't be stated in mathematics, it's immediately suspect. All right, so if it can't be said in math, then it shouldn't be said by economists. That's the gist of it. Surely, all that the Austrians need to claim is that we shouldn't allow the applicability of mathematics to define the scope of economics. It can be used, in fact is used, by Rothbard and Hayek and others where it's applicable, but not otherwise. If it loses its applicability for one reason or another, well, go on without it, right? Just don't let it impose a constraint of its own. Let me give you a little example to show when it's applicable and when it's not. And I take my example actually from outside of economics, but it still illustrates the point. I was at a conference several years ago when a claim was made by my good friend John Eger, Towson State University, that anything, inside economics or out, can be stated in mathematical terms. Anything. And to illustrate this, he took the old saw, absence makes the heart grow fonder. And he defined his terms, and he wrote it as a differential equation. Derivative of f, that's fondness, with respect to x, that's distance greater than 0. So he did it. I was a formal commentator on that paper. And what I showed is that you could adopt his same techniques in translating and translate the expression growing fonder makes the heart absent. And you get the same mathematical expression. Okay? Now, the point here is that the verb makes, absence makes the heart. That's what carries the direction of causality, isn't it? That's what tells you what causes what. And math is silent on causality. That's why the Austrians don't like to use math in their economics, because they're interested in establishing causal relationships. Right? Math is silent on causal relationships. You have to add some theory to be able to pick that up. Right? So what John Eger ended up showing was not simply that you could say anything with math, but rather when you say things in math, you lose all contact with the direction of causality. And of course, there's other mischief there. If you hand this derivative to self-respecting neoclassical economists, you know what he's going to do. He's going to integrate it and plug in initial conditions and solve for the absolute level of fondness. So take the middle ground view when it does you some good. Now, I have a short amount of time here to suggest why there are causes for optimism in the Austrian school. And I've suggested that there are ways in which the Keynesians and the monetarists are opposite one another, and the Austrians are in the middle. But there are also ways in which the Keynesians and monetarists are alike, and the Austrians are different. And I think this is important to see, too. I found a passage in Friedman where he's explaining how Keynes was the right kind of economist. Keynes had it right as far as his methodology goes. And by that, he went on to explain that what Keynes does before he begins theorizing is that he simply gets a feel for the economy. He simply sees what magnitudes, consumption, investment, and government spending, income, what magnitudes tend to move the most. Where's the action? Well, you see swings in income, you see swings in consumption, swings in investment. So those are the relevant building blocks of the theory. First look at the movements and then start patching them together to see what kind of a theory you can come up with. And Friedman endorses this. He said that's the way you do it. That's the way you do economics. Keynes happened to get some of it wrong. He had the wrong elasticities. He had the wrong ideas about stability conditions, but he was looking at the right magnitudes. In fact, Friedman goes Keynes one better and looks at total output and swings in that. The Austrians, by comparison, are structuralists. They don't start by looking at the swings. They start by looking how the economy is put together at its micro roots. Okay, start with the action axiom. Build up from there. Economists have to be careful about how they use the word structure, but it's a word you run into a lot in Austrian economics. Machlup once did a survey of the literature to find out how many ways the word structure is used. He found 23 different meanings among 22 different economists. Schumpeter had two views, which was typical. But the Austrians look at structure, and one of the things they're able to see is the crucial importance of the interest rate, even if the interest rate doesn't change very much. All right? In other words, especially if it doesn't, especially if the change is insidious. If there's an insidious departure of the market rate from its so-called natural level that persists over time, even though it's difficult to detect, either at the time or ex post, it causes big problems. Okay, little causes, in terms of magnitude, can accumulate and have big effects. And that is a conclusion that is bound to be missed by both Keynesians and monetarists. So-called new Keynesians are just now beginning to figure this out. Not about the interest rate, they pay not much attention to it, but about the idea that small causes can have big effects. And it's amazing how much time the new Keynesians spend in justifying this general notion that small causes can have big effects. I've referred to this for some years now as the Smokey the Bear principle. Okay, sure, small causes can have big effects. Otherwise, we wouldn't have to worry about a smoker causing a forest fire. But it gets justified by the new Keynesians. Now, unfortunately, they don't look at interest rates. What they're looking at is something called menu costs. In other words, the small cost of actually changing the price tag on merchandise you're trying to sell can end up having big effects in terms of a depression. Okay, rather implausible structure that they have in their system, but nonetheless, they've got the small cause, big effect idea right. Look for your small causes in interest rate movements and the big effects in terms of artificial booms and inevitable busts. I think the Austrians should be contrarians in the sense of going against the trends in economics these days. It should pay off. You have to wait for a turning point, but it should pay off. And let me explain why. History of thought is a course that's being dropped out of curriculums at lots and lots of universities. People don't study it anymore. They don't know it. Okay? They don't ever learn it. It's not they knew it and forgot it. They just don't ever learn it. What they learn is techniques. They learn how to develop what they call fully articulated artificial economies, little models that may or may or may not be relevant to anything, and typically isn't. I predict the time will come that the irrelevance of these models will be increasingly apparent. And as that happens, you have to fall back on something else, somebody that knows something about the history of ideas and spontaneous order and Carl Menger. And these are abilities that you don't pick up overnight. You can't go from specifying fully articulated artificial economies to doing real economics in terms of the rich history of those ideas that have developed over the years. The Austrians will be in a favorable position once the bankruptcy of some of these other avenues becomes more apparent. I'll even show you how to put math to good use, if only in a defensive mode. And I'll turn here to some key issues in macroeconomics. Might mention, by the way, that macroeconomics is increasingly omitted from Austrian economics. If you look at Karen Vaughn's book, for instance, you find almost no mention of macroeconomics. Or if you look at Israel Kirzner's compilation of Austrian classics, you see no hint that the Austrians ever asked a macro question or offered a macro answer. So one of my goals, I'll state it as a goal rather than a prediction, bring macroeconomics back into Austrian economics. And put capital theory back in macroeconomics. That's actually my research program. My research agenda is to get capital theory back in macroeconomics. Keynes always talked about the dark forces of time and ignorance that envelop our future. And with Keynes, the dark forces always won out. Okay? But the forces were dark because he didn't have any capital theory. Couldn't possibly see what was going on within the structure. Hayek had capital theory and could see what was going on. Interest rate variations allows people to trade off between consumption now and consumption later, or between current consumption and current investment. And here's how you use math in economics, in macroeconomics. When you look at any macro model that's presented in the journals, in the literature, the first thing I do is always take a first derivative of consumption with respect to investment. Okay? And the model can be complicated, and you might have to use some chain rules, and you have to know a little bit of calculus, but take a derivative of consumption with respect to investment. And in almost all cases, it's constrained to be a positive number. In other words, C and I move together. But in any model in which C and I always move together, it's going to be a model that describes a malfunctioning economy, because the economy has to allow for C and I to move against one another, for people to consume less now in order to consume more in the future, which means consume less now in order to invest more now. I has to go up when C goes down. And if it's built right into the model that those two magnitudes move the same way, you can dismiss it immediately as being the model of a malfunctioning economy. Okay? And this is something the mainstream doesn't know about because they don't have capital theory. They haven't become sensitized to this at all. Well, in summary, I want to go back to Vaughn's two-way distinction and simply make it three-way. Vaughan talks about supplementing and about undercutting. I'm suggesting we look at developing, that is, developing the Austrian framework. Vaughan looks at Kirzner and his legacy, at the legacy of Lachman. I suggest that we look at the legacy of Rothbard and Mises. Vaughan looks at NYU and GMU, that's George Mason University. I suggest that we look at AU, which is not only the chemical symbol for gold, but also Auburn University and the home of the Mises Institute. Thank you much.